The pale stranger. The train screamed to a stop, its brakes shrieking against the quiet of the night. Edward Martin, a young journalist from New York, stepped out onto the bleak platform of Silver Creek. The air was sharp, almost biting, and seemed to carry with it a strange stillness, as if the land itself held its breath. He pulled his coat tight around him and looked around. It was a vacant platform, but for an odd lantern swinging with the wind, its dim light casting elongated shadows upon the cracked wooden boards beneath his feet. Silver Creek was nothing that Edward had ever heard of. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, it was a place full of mystery and whispers of strange figures seen in the woods, of a pale stranger who appeared when the fog was thickest, and of townsfolk who spoke in hushed tones about what should not be disturbed. Edward had come seeking answers. His editor had dismissed the stories as mere folklore, but Edward knew better. Folklore often had roots in reality, and he was determined to uncover the truth. He had spent months following leads, gathering accounts from travelers and drifters who had dared to venture into Silver Creek. Now, standing in the heart of it, he felt a mix of excitement and unease. "Mr. Martin?" A voice cut through the silence. Edward turned to see a man in his 60s, with a weathered face and a lantern in hand. He wore a long coat that flapped slightly in the wind. "Yes, I'm Edward Martin," he said, extending a hand. The man hesitated before shaking it. "Name's Joseph. I run the inn. Follow me. Nights here. They're not safe." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Not safe? Because of the stories about the pale stranger?" Joseph's face darkened. He didn't reply, turning instead on his heel and walking briskly down the cobbled path. Edward followed, his journalist's curiosity piqued. Silver Creek was deathly quiet. The houses were old, their wooden frames creaking in the wind. Lanterns hung on rusted hooks, their light flickering weakly. Edward noticed that most of the windows were either shuttered or covered with thick curtains, as if the townsfolk wanted to keep something out, or in. They came to the inn, a small but solid building with the sign, "The Traveler's Rest," in flaking paint. Joseph unlocked the door and gestured Edward inside. The interior was simple but clean, with a stone fireplace crackling faintly in one corner. "You're staying here," Joseph said, putting the lantern down on a wooden table. "Do not walk around at night. And for God's sake, don't check the windows if you hear something odd." Edward chuckled unsteadily. "You're really selling the place." Joseph didn't laugh. He looked at Edward, his eyes serious. "You think it's funny now. You won't when the fog sets in." Edward wanted to probe further, but he was left alone when Joseph excused himself. So he unpacked his bag. He pulled out his notebook and camera. Sitting near the fire, he started jotting down his observations below. Town is isolated, quiet. Residents seem wary, fearful. Stories of the pale stranger likely tied to old superstitions. As he wrote, a low howl echoed through the night. Edward froze his pen hovering above the page. The sound wasn't that of a wolf or wind. It was something else altogether, something guttural and haunting. Edward moved out to investigate. Wearing his coat and toting a camera, he stepped into the cool air. The town seemed shrouded in living fog, swirling and boiling into unnatural shapes. He couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of himself. Still, he continued to make his way down the path, his boots crunching gravel as he went. "Hello?" he called out into the muffling fog. No answer, only the sound of his breathing and the faint creak of something in the distance. Then he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the fog. It was pale, almost luminous, and unnaturally still. Edward squinted, trying to make out the details, but the fog grew thick again, obscuring the figure. "Who's there?" demanded Edward, holding up his camera. He snapped the picture, the flash briefly lighting up the figure. Then, when the light receded, it was gone. A shiver ran along his spine. He quickly returned to the inn, locking the door behind him. As he reviewed the photo on his camera, his hands trembled. It was blurry, but the figure was there, tall, gaunt, and obscured by mist. The next morning, Edward decided to visit the local church, the oldest building in Silver Creek. It was a small, weathered structure with stained glass windows that depicted scenes from the Bible. Inside, he found Father Elias, the town's priest. "Father Elias, I'm Edward Martin, a journalist," he began. "I'm here to learn about the stories of this town, especially about the pale stranger." Father Elias let out a deep sigh. "You are not the first stranger to come seeking answers here, but some answers are left unspoken for a reason." "Why do people fear the pale stranger?" Edward insisted. The priest paused, taking a moment before answering. "They say he is not of this world, that he is an angel of death, appearing to those who are destined. Many who lay eyes on him never leave to tell the tale." Edward scowled. "Marked? What does that mean?" Father Elias turned away. "You should leave, Mr. Martin, before it is too late." That night, as Edward came back to the inn, he saw something on his door. A symbol scrawled in ash, looking like a cross with rough ends. He asked Joseph about it, but the innkeeper's face went pale. "It is a warning," Joseph whispered. "You have been marked." "Marked for what?" Edward insisted. "For him," Joseph said, his voice shaking. "The pale stranger." Edward did not believe in ghosts or curses, but a creeping unease settled over him. He locked his door and sat before the fire, intent to know the truth. As night was deepening, the fog returned thicker and heavier, and Edward again heard it. The low, guttural howl, then the faint sounds of footsteps outside his window. He was pounding on his heart, peering out through the curtains, when he only saw the fog swirling. And then came the whisper, soft but chilling. "Leave, or stay forever." Edward stepped back, his blood running cold. He knew now that this was no ordinary town, and the stories of the pale stranger were more than mere superstition. The chapter ends with Edward realizing that he is entangled in a mystery far darker than he ever anticipated. The wind moaned and tore through the streets of Silver Creek, carrying an icy, chill air with it. Sitting by the fireplace of the dimly lit room he maintained at the Traveler's Rest, Edward Martin looked down at the open book to his left. He wrote notes taken from last night using slightly shaking hands. Marked. But for what? He muttered to himself, glancing uneasily at the ash symbol still faintly visible on the inn's door. The image of the pale figure he had captured on his camera haunted him. Its ghostly form burned into his mind. Edward wasn't given to yielding to fear easily. As a journalist, he'd uncovered stories of corruption and greed and even murder in the dark recesses of an individual's heart. Yet nothing had prepared him for the oppressive dread that seemed to permeate this strange town. The fog had grown thicker since sunset, covering the streets with an unnatural white veil. Every now and then, Edward thought he heard faint whispers carried on the wind, though he couldn't make out the words. The fog seemed alive, as if it watched and waited. A sudden knock at the door made him jump, its sound ringing through the silent inn. Edward hesitated before getting up and crossing the room to answer it. When he opened the door, a woman stood there. She wore a heavy coat with her hood pulled low over her face. Her voice was urgent. "You have to get out," she said, desperation etched in her voice. Edward furrowed his brow. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows what happens to people who stay too long in Silver Creek," she replied. "You've been marked. The pale stranger will come for you." Edward studied her closely, trying to gauge if she was another superstitious local or if there was more to her story. Why does he come? What does he want? The lady was shaking her head. "Nobody knows, but everybody who saw him do not survive. He takes them into the fog, and they never come out. Before Edward could ask something more, the woman got gone back into the mist, so he had a lot more questions than answers. He determined to go back and search the town. Taking with him his camera and flashlight, he descended into the town in the foggy night, unable to see more than 2 feet before him from the light that engulfed in darkness. As he walked, he felt a weird sense of the town being deserted. Doors were bolted shut and windows covered with heavy drapes. It was as if the townsfolk were hiding from something or someone. A faint sound caught his ear, the distant tolling of a bell. Edward pursued it, his footsteps clanging off the stones. It led him to the end of the forest that girdled the town. There, half hidden by the fog, stood an old bell tower, its structure weathered and crumbling. The bell tolled again, though there was no wind to move it. He hesitated before stepping closer. Inside the tower, the air was thick and cold. The wooden stairs groaned beneath Edward's weight as he climbed, every step making him more nervous. At the top, he found the bell swinging, as if it were being swayed by invisible hands. There were marks on the walls, carved into them, similar to the ones on his door, crosses with jagged edges, and surrounded by strange runes. He took his camera out, snapping pictures of the markings. The air dropped colder. Edward's breath puffed out in the dim light as a chilling presence filled the room. He turned, the flashlight cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing there. "Leave." The whisper was faint but unmistakable. Edward froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He spun around, expecting to see someone, or something, but the room was empty. The bell tolled again, louder this time, and the floor beneath him trembled. Edward stumbled, nearly dropping his flashlight. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. Bolting down the stairs, he fled the tower and back into the foggy streets. He headed back to the inn to study the photographs he had taken. The symbols on the wall were unlike anything he had ever seen. He was frantically flipping through his notes, hoping that he could find a clue that no accounts he had collected had. Then he found something unsettling. In the corner of one of the snaps was the pale-skinned creature. It seemed to stand at the edge of a bell tower, its black hole's eyes staring straight back at the camera. Edward's hands trembled, setting the camera down. Try as he might, he could not rationalize what he had seen. In his hands, the evidence was glaring. The pale stranger was out there, and it was stalking him. Edward slept little that night. He woke up to the sound of footsteps outside his window. He slowly pulled back the curtain, his heart racing. The fog was so thick that he could barely see beyond the glass. But then he saw it. A tall, pale figure standing motionless in the street. Edward's breath had caught in his throat. He couldn't see this figure's face, but something about its presence was almost suffocating. The figure didn't move, and yet Edward felt it peer through him. A knock at the door made him jump in surprise. He turned away from the window and opened the door, looking cautiously into the hallway. But it was empty. The floor was littered with one piece of paper. Edward picked it up, reading the chilling words in jagged handwriting. "You can't escape the fog." The chapter ends with Edward discovering that the pale stranger's reach extends far beyond what he had imagined. The fog is not just a natural phenomenon. It is a trap, and he is its prey. The fog pressed against the windows of the Traveler's Rest, a living, breathing entity that refused to dissipate. Edward sat in the corner of his room, the piece of paper with its haunting message still clenched in his hand. He hadn't slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the shutters had kept him on edge. The pale figure's image was burned into his memory, and the words on the note echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. "You cannot escape the fog." The town was changing, or perhaps Edward just now began to notice that. It had been no longer silent, no longer hushed and peaceful. Everywhere seemed dark, and every corner had its shadow, every little noise evilly sounding. He did not even know why. He had this feeling that they were following him. Edward had seen enough. Packing his stuff quickly, he went downstairs into the inn lobby, where Joseph stood tending to the fire. "I must go," said Edward brusquely. Joseph raised his head. His face was pale and worry lined his features. "Too late," he whispered. Edward furrowed his brows. "What do you mean?" "The train will bring me back." Joseph shook his head slowly. "There's no leaving Silver Creek once the fog claims you." Determined not to give in to fear, Edward decided to gather more information. He ventured into the heart of the town, where he found the local general store, a small, cluttered space filled with canned goods, dusty shelves, and the sharp scent of kerosene. The shopkeeper, a wiry man with thinning hair, glanced up nervously as Edward entered. "You're the journalist," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. Edward nodded. "I need answers. What is this place? And what is the pale stranger?" The shopkeeper hesitated, then leaned closer. "Silver Creek wasn't always like this. The fog. It came after the incident at the mines." "The mines," Edward pressed, pulling out his notebook. "Years ago," the man explained, his hands thrumming on a tin of biscuits. "The miners dug too deep, uncovered something they shouldn't have. A chamber, an altar. After that, the fog came, and with it him." Edward scribbled furiously. "Him? You mean the pale stranger?" The shopkeeper nodded. "He's a harbinger, a warning. Those marked by him." His voice faltered, and he glanced around as if expecting the stranger to appear at any moment. "They never leave." Edward thanked the man and stepped outside, his mind racing. The mention of the mines piqued his curiosity. If there was an altar or chamber, perhaps it held the key to understanding the fog and its malevolent presence. The entrance to the old Silver Creek mines was overgrown with weeds and shrouded in mist. A rusted gate blocked the way, but Edward climbed over it with little effort. The air grew colder as he approached the yawning blackness of the mine's entrance, the fog curling around him like icy fingers. Edward switched on his flashlight and stepped inside. The walls were damp, the air thick with the smell of decay and earth. As he ventured deeper, the sound of dripping water echoed around him, creating a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. It didn't take long for him to find the chamber. The mine shaft opened into a wide, circular room. Its walls were etched in jagged symbols that he'd seen at the bell tower. In the center of the chamber stood an altar, made of black stone with a smooth, cold touch. He was flashing some shots around that moment, his flashlight throwing unsettling shades about walls. He saw something disturbing. Bones were strewn at the altar. Human. His stomach turned inside and he pushed himself to view further. There were also some more runes on stone, along with a drawing. A tall, skeletal fellow with sunken eyes, palms outstretched in what appeared to be supplication. "The pale stranger," he breathed. As he traced the carvings with his fingers, a gust of wind rushed through the chamber, extinguishing his flashlight. The darkness was absolute. Edward fumbled with his flashlight, his hands shaking. He finally managed to switch it back on, but the beam of light barely penetrated the thick fog that had seeped into the chamber. Then he heard it, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all around him. "Edward!" He froze, his hair standing on end at the back of his neck. The voice was distorted, almost inhuman, and it knew his name. "Leave!" The whisper continued. "Before it's too late." Edward's instinct screamed at him to run, but his curiosity held him in place. He turned slowly, the flashlight's beam sweeping across the room. That was when he saw them shadows moving inside the fog, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. They circled the chamber of his mind, their movement jerky and unnatural. "Who are you?" Edward demanded, his voice shaking. The shadows made no reply. Instead, they closed in, their outline taking on definition. Edward could catch glimpses of empty eyes and twisted limbs before turning to run. Edward didn't stop running until he was back in his room at the Traveler's Rest. He locked the door and collapsed onto the bed, his chest heaving. The fog had followed him, pressing against the windows like a living thing. As he scanned the photos he had taken, something caught his attention and terrified him. In every photo, the pale stranger appeared there, lurking in the background, observing. Then he realized the truth. Fog was not just a phenomenon, and a pale stranger not just a ghost. They were connected, and to Silver Creek and to him. That night, whispers came back, louder and more insistent. They talked of things that Edward couldn't understand. Their voices wove into his dreams and turned them into nightmares. The chapter ends with Edward waking in a cold sweat, realizing that his time is running out. The fog is closing in, and the pale stranger is getting closer. The fog outside Edward's window was no longer a silent menace. It whispered now, its voice a collective of murmurs and sighs that seeped through the cracks of the inn. The pale stranger's presence was no longer confined to fleeting glimpses. It was a tangible weight pressing on Edward's chest, making each breath laborious. Edward sat at his desk, the photographs from the mine spread out before him. Each one seemed to have a life of its own. The pale figure grew clearer with every glance. In the last picture, snapped just before he fled, something was new. The pale stranger's hand stretching toward the camera, those long skeletal fingers reaching outward in a strange, impossible arc. Edward's thoughts moved at a pace. He wanted to find answers, and he needed them fast. There were things the townspeople were hiding, and Edward had no intention of leaving Silver Creek, if one was possible, without getting it straight. First stop. Edward went to the local church, a small, worn building at the edge of the square. The cross atop its steeple was leaning precariously as if bowing under the weight of time and despair. Inside, cold, damp air clung in every corner, the pews empty except for one lone figure sitting at the altar, Pastor James. The pastor looked up as Edward entered, his weary eyes scanning the journalist's face. "You've seen him, haven't you?" Edward nodded, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "I need to know what's happening here." Pastor James let out a deep sigh and nodded for Edward to sit. "The pale stranger is no man. He is a remnant, a fragment of something far older than this town. The miners awakened it, and now it feeds." "Feeds on what?" Edward asked, his pen poised over his notebook. "Fear," the pastor replied, his voice trembling. "Despair. The fog isn't just a veil. It's a predator, and the pale stranger is its harbinger. Those it marks are already lost." Edward's grip tightened on his pen. "What about the altar in the mines? What does it mean?" The pastor hesitated, his hands clasped tightly together. "It's a gateway, a door to something beyond comprehension. The symbols, they bind it, but the bindings are weakening. If the door opens completely, the fog won't stop at Silver Creek." Edward's blood ran cold. He had come seeking a story, but what he had found was something far darker and far more dangerous than he could have imagined. As Edward left the church, the fog seemed thicker, more oppressive. The whispers grew louder, their words still unintelligible but carrying a weight that made his chest tighten. He resolved to return to the inn, but the streets twisted around him, leading him in circles, and every time he faced the unknown. Shadows darted in and out of his peripheral vision whenever he tried to focus on them. The cobblestones beneath his feet were uneven, as if the ground itself was shifting. Then he saw it. The pale stranger stood at the end of the street, its hollow eyes fixed on Edward. It didn't move, but the fog around it swirled violently, as if alive. Edward backed away, his breath coming in short gasps. The stranger tilted its head, a grotesque mimicry of curiosity, and then began to walk toward him. Panic shot through Edward as he turned and ran. The fog clutched at his limbs like cold, wet hands. He ran into an alley, pressing himself against the wall with a pounding heart. The whispers grew louder, drowning his thoughts. "Edward!" they hissed. "Edward!" He clamped his hands over his ears, but the voices seemed to come from inside his head. Just as he felt he was going to be consumed by the fog, the world shifted. The alley became dark, and Edward found himself again in the chamber of the mine. Before him was the altar, glowing faintly with some eerie light. Around the room stood the shadows he had seen before, their forms more solid now. They chanted in a language Edward couldn't understand, their voices merging into a single droning hum. The pale stranger stepped forward, its skeletal hand outstretched. Edward tried to move, but his body refused to obey. The stranger placed its hand on his chest, and Edward's vision exploded into fragments of light and shadow. He saw glimpses of the past, the miners breaking through the chamber's walls, their faces twisted in horror as the fog swallowed them up. He saw the altar, its surface slick with blood, and the pale stranger rising out of its depths. He saw the future, a world suffocated by fog, its inhabitants mere shadows of who they once were, eyes hollow and staring into eternity. Edward woke up on cobblestones, his body shivering. The fog had pulled back a little, but the heavy weight in the air remained. He walked back to the inn, where Joseph was waiting for him. "You have seen it, haven't you?" Joseph asked, barely whispering. Edward nodded, his hands trembly as he poured himself a glass of water. The fog, the stranger, all connected to the altar. If we don't stop it... Joseph spoke over him. "Can't be stopped. Door's been opened, and the pale stranger will rest, not until it has taken you." It ends with Edward fully realizing the danger at hand. The pale stranger is more than just an omen. He is a force of nature, relentless and unstoppable. The fog is closing in, and time is running out for Edward. The night had swallowed Silver Creek whole. The streets were empty, but the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. Edward stood at the window of his room at the Traveler's Rest, staring out into the fog that clung to the town like a living nightmare. It wasn't passive anymore. It was closing in, tightening its grip with every passing second. His mind was racing. The visions in the mine were too vivid, too alive. The pale stranger wasn't just a ghost nor a myth. He was a messenger of destruction. The fog was his harbinger, his way to an end to all this. Edward had made a decision. There was no escape. The fog had consumed the town, and it would soon consume him as well. But before it did, he would end this nightmare. He had to go back to the mine. The altar beckoned him, its dark presence haunting his thoughts like a malevolent echo. The townsfolk had been right. He was marked, and no one had ever escaped once the pale stranger had taken them. But there had to be a way to stop it, to seal the door forever. Edward walked through the town streets, fog-shrouded, every step with heavy dread. The place seemed different now. It felt quieter, as though buildings were holding their breaths. His flashlight made dim, long shadows because of the dense mist, like they were alive on their own. The oppressive silence all around him was deafening, except for his own steady heartbeat thumping through his ears. The mine entrance loomed ahead, its rusted gate now completely twisted, as if the fog itself had reshaped it. Edward forced it open, the creaking sound like a scream in the stillness. He descended into the depths once more, the air growing colder with every step. He reached the chamber. The altar was as he had left it, but now it pulsed with a strange energy, the symbols carved into its surface glowing faintly in the dim light. Edward could feel the air shift as if the fog itself was alive, watching him. The whispers, too, had returned. They were louder now, more insistent. He slowly walked up to the altar, a battle with each step, the overwhelming force that could push him away. At the edge of the room, The pale stranger seemed to stand before him. His hollow eyes were fixed upon Edward. "You cannot stop it," the stranger's voice echoed in his mind. "You are already part of it." Edward clenched his fists at the truth of those words. He could not escape the fog, nor the stranger, but there was something else, something hidden in the darkness. An answer, perhaps, hidden deep within the altar itself. Edward's hands shook as he went for the altar, and the instant his fingers touched the cold stone, energy injected through him, and he was launched into darkness. He stood in a vast open space, empty and infinite. The fog was everywhere, twisting and writhing, and the pale stranger stood before him, his figure towering. "You will join us," the stranger said, his voice a low growl. "You will be a part of the fog, a part of what has no end." The world around Edward started to unravel, with the edges of reality blurring as the fog consumed everything. He felt himself weakening, his breath shortening. He was losing himself to the fog, to the stranger, to the curse that had claimed Silver Creek. But then, in some deep recess of his soul, a spark of revolt flared. Edward thought of the miner's words. He could seal the door shut. He could contain the fog. The altar might have power, but it could not be absolute. That fog could be bound again, too. With all his might, Edward focused on the symbols etched into the altar. The words of the miners echoed in his mind, the ancient chant that had once sealed the altar. He began to chant, his voice a hoarse whisper in the vast, empty space. As he did, the fog began to retreat, swirling violently as if fighting against the force. The pale stranger screamed, his shape undulating and changing like a thing torn asunder, torn from the very pith of his being. Edward's vision went blurry and started spinning around the room. The power of the chant was coursing through his veins. The fog recoiled, but it didn't matter. Edward felt his body buck with energy, the power of the altar coursing through him like a living thing. With one last, despairing scream, Edward flung the words of the chant out into the void. The fog screamed in anguish, and the pale stranger slumped into nothingness. The chamber shook, the symbols upon the altar burning in an intense, blinding light. Edward woke to find himself inside the mine, his body sprawled across the cool, moist ground. The fog was away. The pressure that gripped Silver Creek had lightened. All was stilled, as if the entire world held its breath with him. Slowly he got up from the stone, his aching body drinking in what had been left. The altar was there, but all of that was gone. Only the dim glow of some carvings on stone was visible now. Town free. Silver Creek. He knew Edward would never again be that man with no shadows on him. The pale stranger was gone, but the fog lingered in his mind. It was always there now, an ever-present shadow. The whispers still echoed, but Edward had fought back and won. For now. As he walked back to town, the first light of dawn broke through the fog, spreading its golden rays over deserted streets. Edward knew this was just one battle in a war that had no end. The fog might have been sealed, but it was not destroyed, and the pale stranger's presence would always haunt the edges of his mind. But for now, Edward was free.